This episode of Cello Chat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com.
Okay, and we're live.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. I'm Christopher Costanza. I am at home in the loft of my condo in Stanford, California, which is, well, I think probably most of you know where it is, but it's Northern California, south of San Francisco. I teach at Stanford University. This is my 20th year at Stanford. And my day job has been primarily, besides teaching and coaching chamber music, I've been the cellist of the St. Lawrence String Quartet. And not to start on a sad note, but many of you may know that our first violinist, Jeff Nuttall, passed away this past October after a year-long battle with pancreatic cancer. So the quartet's activities are on hold at the moment while we sort of figure out what's next for us. But I'm filling my schedule with various activities, musically speaking, which I've been enjoying quite a lot. I would tend to do those sorts of things anyway, even while in the quartet, I suppose it's safe to say. But for example, I think it was 3 weeks ago today, 3 weeks ago yesterday, I played all 6 Bach cello suites in a day at Stanford. I didn't do it in the sort of Yo-Yo Ma way of just walking out and doing them all in a row. I split it into 2 concerts, an afternoon concert and an evening concert. And I did something that I thought was interesting. Anyway, I started with the 6th suite and ended with the 1st. So I did 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 in that order. And prior to that Saturday's performances, I presented a number of other activities surrounding Bach cello suites on campus, on Stanford campus, including a lecture. I put together the 2nd version of the Stanford Cello Choir. It's a new project of mine. I did an earlier cello choir set of activities last June, and then this fall we gradually got things ramped up again, and I did put together with my students and some of my colleagues' students a cello choir concert consisting entirely of music of Bach, sort of as a ramp up again to the cello suites performance. So it was a busy week. I played in some classes and talked about Bach. And a lot of other projects on the horizon for me. My background, I studied at New England Conservatory, happily, and have a bachelor's and an artist diploma from the conservatory. I studied with David Wells, with Larry Lesser, and with Bernard Greenhouse there, as well as receiving chamber music coachings from some of the great old masters, such as Eugene Lehner and Louis Krasner and Leonard Shure. And so it was an incredible time. And when I was 21 and still an undergraduate, I won the Young Concert Artist International Auditions. And that opened a lot of doors, started to do a lot more solo playing and a lot more chamber music playing as well. Shortly after that, I went to the Marlboro Festival and met a lot of wonderful people there. And I feel like a lot of what's happened in my career, a lot of the opportunities I've had and the exciting adventures I've been on have in some way been relatable to either, NEC, Young Concert Artists, and Marlboro. And so I think about all of those experiences on a daily basis in teaching and playing. And so the soonest upcoming project of mine, I suppose I could say, besides a couple of smaller chamber music projects I have, is this piece called Don Quixote by Richard Strauss. And the timing of today's chat is such that I haven't actually performed it yet. In fact, tomorrow is my first rehearsal with the Stanford Symphony. It promises to be an exciting project on a number of levels. First of all, the Stanford Symphony Orchestra consists of, I'm thinking, about 100 players at the moment. We have some music majors. A lot of the players in the orchestra are majoring in computer science or biology or some other topic altogether. But they're passionate musicians. Many of my students are in the orchestra. Many of my chamber music students, as well as cello students, are in the orchestra. In fact, the violist playing the role of Sancho Panza in the story of Don Quixote is one of my chamber music students who I've known for several years. The concertmaster is another one of my chamber music students, and he's concertmaster of Stanford Symphony. He just won our concerto competition on piano, so he's multi-talented. I'm not even sure what his major is. I don't think it's music. No, it's not. But he's one of those multifaceted, brilliant people who we see here at this university. So it'll be a passionate group of students, and the conductor is very excited about it. But what's even more exciting is it's very likely that not a single one of those students has ever played the piece. Hopefully they're getting to know it through listening and studying and the rehearsals that the orchestra's had thus far. Our conductor, Paul Phillips, told me that he had never done the piece before. And so this is his first run at it. And I myself have never played the piece before. I learned the part when I was still a student at NEC, actually. And I've taken very few orchestra auditions in my life, but the first one was for principal of Cincinnati Symphony in, I think it was 1989. And one of the while I was still an artist diploma student, and one of the pieces on the list, as is the case for, I think, most principal auditions for orchestras, Don Quixote was on the list. So I said, I've got to learn this thing. So I basically went through and got my old international part edited by Leonard Rose, very heavily edited by Leonard Rose, and worked through it and got to know it, played the audition, didn't get the job, which is totally fine. And then around that time, I was studying with Bernard Greenhouse, and I recall bringing it into a lesson once. And I had that plus a few other pieces, and I said, I'd like to play Don Quixote for you. And he said, well, do you have anything else? He was clearly not wanting to teach Don Quixote. So that was my one potential lesson with a teacher on the piece, and it didn't happen. So this is entirely self-taught. Now that I'm, well into my 50s, I don't feel bad about that in any way, jumping into a piece such as this without having studied it with a teacher. But, the study of such a piece can be done on so many different levels. First of all, I've been studying the score very extensively. I've been reading about the piece quite a lot, and I want to share. I'll share the screen in a little bit to show you some things that I've discovered about it. I'm tapping into my long-term memories of the piece, because I got to know it from listening to it when I was probably in high school. And many of you may know the recording with Rostropovich and Von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic. And I remember my dad had bought I believe it was on the Angel recording label, EMI Angel, and it was one of the pre-recorded cassettes that we used to listen to in the car. And it was one of the pieces that I loved to listen to in our car stereo system while driving from Utica, New York to Rochester for my lessons at Eastman. One of the reasons was I loved the piece. The other reason was, for some reason, those Angel cassettes were louder than other cassettes, so you could actually hear them with the road noise underneath you. So we listened to that recording a lot. There's a video, a live of the live performance of that same cast of characters playing the piece with Rostropovich and Von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic, and perhaps some of you have seen that. It's remarkable playing. I mean, it's Rostropovich just being Rostropovich and singing through his cello as only he could do. Now, more recently, I just a couple of weeks ago, I discovered a Lynn Harrell performance with a German orchestra. I'm guessing it was made in the early 2000s. Another very, very beautiful interpretation, and Lynn Harrell is being Lynn Harrell in the performance. He's doing his thing, his signature vibrato and slides and way of playing. In both cases, these artists played the piece from memory, which is an interesting topic, because I see Don Quixote as of course, it's a tone poem, and we know that. Many of us probably know quite a bit about the story, the Cervantes novel from, I believe, the 17th century. And I have not read it myself. It is epic, as we know. And I've certainly read a synopsis of it, or many different ones, as a matter of fact. So we know we've got this tone poem at a time when Strauss was writing tone poems in the late 19th century. He was in his 30s. prior to him becoming more well-known as an opera composer. He was writing some opera at this point in his career, but the operas came a bit later. And you may think of, I first and foremost nowadays think of Strauss as an opera composer because I've gotten to know several of his operas. My wife plays in the Santa Fe Opera Orchestra every summer, and so when the Santa Fe Opera started, John Crosby, who began started the company from scratch. He had met and known Strauss a little bit, and would program a Richard Strauss opera every single summer. So he would go through the entire cycle of 13 over a period of time. In recent years, Santa Fe doesn't do one so predictably, but I got to know Strauss so much better through listening and seeing those operas. And you might say that his Strauss writing the tone poems was kind of a preview of him becoming this profound opera composer. And of course, some of his earlier works were actually chamber pieces. And for the cellists in the crowd here, we probably all know the cello and piano sonata. I believe it's Opus 6. It's a very early piece in F major. It's terrific sonata. He wrote a piano quartet and a number of chamber works, violin and piano sonata, which is very well known. So this tone poem Don Quixote is a substantial work, probably in the vicinity of 45 minutes in length. And I've just been reading more and more about what each variation, basically what Strauss has done, if you don't know, is he writes an introduction, introduces the main themes, the themes of Don Quixote, Don Quixote's imagined maiden who he's seeking, and Sancho Panza, Don Quixote's faithful servant. And it's an extended introduction. It's at the end of the introduction, the solo cello comes in and provides the opening theme. And perhaps I will just play it. You know it. It's good for me to be playing this more and more because the concerts will be coming up soon. And so I'll just switch my sound so that it goes to original sound. Hopefully this will sound reasonable to you, and I'll just move this a little bit. And unlike Lynn Harrell and Rostropovich, I do not plan to play the piece from memory. I'm amazed at how well various artists have done that over the years. But back to where I was going with my previous comments, it's a large orchestral work, and I feel like the cello is one of the players in that. But of course, the solo viola and also the tenor tuba and the bass clarinet as Sancho Panza. We think of the viola primarily as a Sancho Panza character. Giant viola solos in the piece as well, almost to the point where maybe not almost, probably to the point where the violas should get practically equal billing. And there are recordings of the piece where violas do get proper attention for the work they put into the piece. But this they have this giant introduction where the themes are introduced. There's stormy material, there's peaceful material. It's a very descriptive music, very passionate, intense, romantic writing that only Strauss could create. His own specific harmonic language, his chord progressions, textures, master orchestrator that Strauss was. And then after however many minutes that is, which takes a little bit of time, while the solo cellist sits there and really only plays one little snippet of music at the entire opening part of the piece, the famous, which is the introduction of our main character, Don Quixote. And what we see throughout the piece in the characterization of Don Quixote is there are so many facets to who he is as a character. Of course, he was imaginary, but we kind of get to know him a bit in the piece. And what Strauss has done is he takes us through in the course of the many variations these adventures that Don Quixote has in the novel, including fighting windmills. That's the image that I always had as a youngster. Don Quixote, he's that crazy Spanish character who rides around on his horse with his sidekick and fights windmills. Well, that's one of his adventures, where he has a battle with a windmill and gets knocked off his horse and falls, and that's just depicted beautifully in the music. There's another vivid scene, and this is very much cited as a brilliant use of orchestration and texture. In the, I believe, second variation, there's Don Quixote plunges into this army as if to fight them all off, and it turns out it's a herd of sheep. And so in the orchestration with tremolo and winds and dissonances and muted sounds, we hear the braying, baaing of the sheep from the orchestra. But this opening, it's strong and confident. But then on a dime, it seems to just want to change to something very sweet. And again. And so on and so forth. We have these different sides of the character. It goes from direct and intense to perhaps more compassionate, more thoughtful. In the story of Don Quixote, he decides he has to go out and earn his knighthood, so to speak, in some form or another, and creates these battles, creates these scenes, and lives in a kind of imaginary place, a land between imagination and reality. Again, when I was a youngster and I first heard about Don Quixote, I mean, he was basically, to me, the image of somebody who was, not mentally stable, let's put it that way. And these adventures are sort of depictive of these kinds of experiences that he would have had in his mind or in his life. So we have that opening, the very famous opening, the first variation, where he's going forth. Et cetera, et cetera. This big kind of driving, intense rhythmic place, and at a certain point he's fighting windmills, and he collapses to the ground in this arpeggio that I always find incredibly difficult. This diminished arpeggio that I'm looking forward to it being covered up by the orchestra there, because it's really hard to play in the tempo prescribed. But he's fallen, and then we have this, he's sort of lying on the ground, and then this sweet side comes back. And then the whimsical. And again. And it ends with this kind of intensity. So we have these juxtaposed, these different sides of this character, and then in between we have a lot of moments of Sancho Panza's character coming through in the solo viola, often with tenor tuba and bass clarinet. So interesting textures as well. As we go through the variations, there are all sorts of amazing things we could point out. What I find interesting is that the role of the solo cello being Don Quixote, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that becomes integrated into the orchestra from my perspective, as I mean, the de facto soloist. I'll be sitting in the solo spot as cellists do when they play the piece, and the way that the part is printed, the score, the part that we'll all use. Any edition, actually, I was hoping to find a beautiful urtext edition of the piece, and if anybody knows of one, please let me know, but I have yet to find one, so I just have an old German edition of it. But there are a number of cello tutti spots where I might choose to join and play. I was talking with our conductor recently about that. and that remains to be seen. But if one doesn't do that as the soloist, there will be a lot of time spent sitting still while listening to the orchestra sounds around you. And I kind of like to be playing, so I suspect I'll be joining in with the orchestra in a number of places. But there is this one beautiful spot where he, it's the fifth variation, and I have some. I want to share with you. I did, it's so easy to do internet research these days, and you come up with all sorts of things. But there was an interesting article from the Indianapolis Symphony, which has been, I think, it was thus far anyway, useful to me. I'm going to share this screen, where he talks about, a number of things. Breaks the piece down. This is the author whose name is, I should give credit. I said he, this is terrible. Marianne. Her notes, I didn't even see who the author was before. Apologies to Marianne. So she writes about this piece at length as a program note, talks about the various characters and the goings-on in each of the variations. And when you get to the fifth one, Don Quixote reflects on his journey and his future conquests, and he dreams of a maiden to love and dramatic feats to win her, while the night, depicted by the violins, harp, and woodwinds, swirl around him. Solo cello meditates on that theme, as that's the imagined maiden that he has created for himself in his head, who he's seeking. So there's this it's basically a cadenza, the fifth variation, and I think without knowing what it depicts, one could misinterpret it, actually. It's a very, things wind down, and there are these chords in the strings, and he's reflecting. Then there's these fleeting moments. And I think it's possibly easy to kind of over-intensify some of this. And one should be, in my opinion, more reflective than outward through most of this, going forward. It gets excited. Sorry. And then the maiden's theme. And so on and so forth. After the maiden's theme comes, there's this sort of swirl of sound. Sorry, I got slightly lost there for 1 second. But swirl of sound, climactic moment, and then this sort of impetuous intensity comes through. So you feel this sort of troubled, perhaps, state of mind that Don Quixote would have been in as he's reflecting and dreaming and wishing. And I think it is our mission in getting to know the piece as performers, and perhaps as listeners too, to kind of understand what each of these characters is. One more to point out, and there's so many interesting things in the course of the piece, it's really quite an adventure, is the closing finale, and as it's described in the document I just shared. I won't reshare it, but it's the epilogue. And Don Quixote arrives home. I mean, he's been in fights. He's defeated, so to speak. And he's exhausted from his journey, and his theme emerges again from the cello in a pitiful cry. He is weakened and near death. Before his death, he recalls his life, a recap of the initial opening themes depicting the central character, then dies as the solo cello descends into its lowest register, playing a final sigh and gasp at the final cadence. So this is this really, I'm sure you're all familiar with this beautiful... And it's one of the great moments in, well, perhaps in all of music, but certainly in all of solo cello with orchestra repertoire that I can think of. It's nostalgic, it's reflective, it's just outwardly beautiful. And the challenge from the cellist for us as a cello soloist is to really decide how romantic and intense it should be. Strauss writes sehr ruhig, which is essentially to be calmer in it, and he writes espressivo as well. And so not that anyone would do that, but one could over express that beautiful motive. And I think there's something perhaps even exhausted. And that's reaching the highest point in the phrase there, and then juxtaposing that with moments which comes up soon thereafter, and finally that last gesture that he writes, and you feel his breath winding down, gasping for air perhaps, or just very near death. And then his last breath, or a death rattle, or whatever we might call it, he expires after all of these adventures that are told in the piece. So it's quite a journey, and I'm, as I mentioned, I'm still discovering it, getting into the practice mode of it, still sorting lots of things out, and happily with a good amount of time to do so. I think, as I mentioned, the performances are in probably about 4 weeks. I think it's 4 weeks, and it's a luxury really to be able to do it here at home with the Stanford Symphony, of a group of such enthusiastic musicians, and the group has been sounding great in the last couple of years. I go to performances frequently with these students who haven't played the piece, but who will be throwing themselves into it with great gusto and passion, and a conductor who's equally enthusiastic. And then also the luxury of having a lot of rehearsal time. I think I mentioned at the beginning, tomorrow was my first rehearsal with the orchestra tomorrow evening. And to be able to do that almost 4 weeks before the performance. Now, I probably won't go to every single rehearsal between tomorrow and the performance. The orchestra will have many on their own. But I consider that an absolute luxury, because when I was doing a fair bit of touring and playing concertos considerably more frequently, and as many of you probably know, it's the norm to have one rehearsal, maybe two, with the orchestra. And if you're flying in from out of town, you only will arrive there a couple of days before the performances begin. And so to get to know the piece this way, to really immerse myself in it, and to also do it in connection to the group and the students in the group is something I'm very, very excited about. I'm feeling that I'll probably get to know the piece really, really well through this process. But also just the whole idea that it is not your typical sort of concerto piece. That it's soloistic. The soloist is featured as a soloist, sitting on the platform to the left of the conductor, like any concerto. And yet it's a large scale chamber piece, really. I mean, that's how I have always thought of solo playing. Obviously, cello and piano. Well, that is a chamber group, duo. Even when I play unaccompanied music, I play my unaccompanied Bach. It's some kind of chamber music, right? It's just single player, but you're communicating with your audience, and you're in a room with people, and it's really just that creating that level of intimacy with your audience. And certainly concertos, I've felt that way quite a lot. I remember one time years ago, I was playing Dvorak concerto with an orchestra in Florida, and the conductor, we were rehearsing, we stopped for something, and he turned to his left, he turned to me and said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's great. Orchestra sounds great." He goes, "Because you keep looking at me, and I want to make sure I'm not doing anything wrong." And I said, "Well, no, I'm just communicating with you. It's part of the process. It's chamber music," I told him, and he got it. But he was so used to the kind of perhaps different approach of that soloists might have in jumping into the work on a concerto. So I've always treated these kinds of pieces as chamber works, large or small. They're still chamber works to me. And sure, I understand. As a soloist, I have to project and maybe play a little differently than I do in my string quartet, and that's exciting too. And yet, the musical conversation is a chamber music conversation, whether it be one person, four people, or 100 people. So that's really how I see it. One other topic regarding this piece is that, of course, it has been recorded countless times, and I mentioned that recording with Rostropovich and Von Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic. I'm going to share the screen one more time because I found an interesting article. It is from the Gramophone magazine. It was published a little less than a year ago. And this author, who is Hugo Shirley, so he speaks quite a lot of these various recordings and shares his preferences. Let me just do my screen sharing one more time here. And this is the article, and I'm sharing it here. And you can find this online. It's gramophone.co.uk, and it's a whole article about these recordings of Don Quixote. And it's an interesting article that speaks of recordings that I certainly wasn't aware of. Made his first recording in 1933. Piatigorsky, Paul Tortelier. Probably aware that those great cellists played the piece, but he goes through and talks about various recordings. I'm really skimming through, as you can see. Emanuel Feuermann recorded the piece more than once. There's Piatigorsky again. Toscanini did it with NBC Symphony and Frank Miller, who we know of as the principal of Chicago Symphony for many years. And he doesn't particularly like that one. He says, it's just a shame that the orchestra's principal cellist, Frank Miller, lacks poetry at times, even if the conductor does create space for him in the finale. So Toscanini also recorded it with Feuermann. And then Antonio Iannicro, and there's Fournier and Tortelier again. And then sometimes you'll see performances and recordings with the principal cellist of the orchestra as soloist, which to me makes an awful lot of sense when you see that the principal violist is playing Sancho Panza, and that's a huge role as well. So it's just a matter of approach. But it's interesting. I'll get to the bottom, and then here's Karajan with Rostropovich. He says it's somewhat generalized in its grandeur. I mean, I always loved it, but I should listen to it again. And then he said it speaks of the lack of At one point, he speaks of the lack of female cellists who have recorded it. Anyway, you can find this article and read it at your leisure. I just will go to the bottom because he speaks of David Zinman from 2003 recording with the Tonhalle Orchestra in Zurich, and Thomas Grossenbacher. He decides that's his favorite recording available right now. I don't know it at all, but it'd be interesting to think about it. And I like the way he says, I hope it says more about the quality of Zinman and his orchestra and of their Strauss survey, released to little fanfare on the super budget Arte Nova label, than about my own lack of imagination that I declare them my top choice now for Don Quixote, as well as Sinfonia Domestica, another one of Strauss's works that he wrote around the same period in the late 19th century. So I just wanted to, I'll stop sharing that now. But these are a few things that I just discovered in my online research over the past few weeks as I've gotten to immerse myself more into the piece. I want to try to get different perspectives on it, and not just listening to it and studying the score, but things that people have written about the piece, more about the story of Don Quixote, so that I might better understand the characters in this drama, so to speak. So how are we with, what is the plan for timing-wise now? I see that it's 8 past the hour. Is it time to go to questions, or shall I ramble on a bit more?
We'll introduce our first question.
Okay.
Our first question is in partnership with our friends at Together with Classical. If you had to introduce classical music to someone for the first time, how would you do it? And what piece would you suggest?
Definitely Strauss' Don Quixote. Because of course we want people to know the cello, we want people to know this great descriptive music. But in all seriousness, I mean, a piece like this could be a way to do it, something really dramatic and intense. The idea that there is a direct storyline, that it's programmatic music, I mean, I think people will connect to that. I mean, on that topic, we could talk about opera and think about, for example, Puccini opera as a way to introduce somebody to classical music. It's hard to know. I mean, I'm a big fan of J.S. Bach, not just the cello suites, but the Passions, cantatas, you name it. And I think I would want to offer somebody who doesn't really know much about classical music and wants to get to know more, a sampling of, for example, the greats, Bach and Mozart, and then a piece like Don Quixote, something descriptive and programmatic, so that a listener can connect to the story while listening to the various effects. So I think that's important, and also maybe something even more contemporary to sort of show the wider scope. I'm opening up my chat here just so I can answer some questions. So that's first of all, that's the first answer that I would give you to the idea of introducing classical music. There is the question here, question from our YouTube audience. How does one vary the color, speed, and timing of shifts in Strauss's works, such as in Don Quixote and in Ein Heldenleben? I mean, the shifting is an incredible topic. I love thinking about shifts. I talk about them in lessons all the time with students. When I was studying with various teachers, we talked about, essentially 3 ways of shifting. I mean, there's a classified as such. I'll just pick a random note. The sort of this is on the new finger, so that's maybe anticipated. The delayed, which is sort of a drop shift, or somewhere in between, where you do some on the old finger and incorporate the new finger. There are more subtle ways of looking at that. But specifically to dealing with this music, I think that's a really interesting topic, because to what degree should we romanticize some of these gestures when we know what the character is? If you think of a tired, defeated Don Quixote, and I think of that finale that I was playing earlier. Do I have my? Yes, I want to make sure I have my original sound on, because on Zoom it will be awful without. If I think potential for, there's already a shift right there, not a big one, it's a perfect fourth, but still, but I could disguise it altogether to make the music just a little more simple. the extreme opposite of that would be something this way. But going forward, here's one. I could. So I have potential in the first 2 measures or so of this finale to shift here. Probably I'm not going to shift to the D, but I might shift here. That's the second one. And then this one not. But then the third measure, that would be a very direct kind of shift. So I'm inclined not to show that one. Show this one a little bit. That a little bit of a drop shift maybe. And that's a more direct sliding one. So basically 3 different approaches or 3 different shifts in a row. But I think the better answer is through singing, to relate all of this to singing. So da da do da ya do da da dum ya da 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 do. Okay, not a great voice, but and I would try to listen to my voice and try to understand technically what I need to do in terms of timing with bow and left hand to create the effect. So hopefully that's a helpful answer. Another question: do you have any tips on coordinating the left and right hand under pressure? Any mental preparation tips to keep the nerves in check, both in timing and relationship between how much vibrato is appropriate for how much bow? Wow. So coordinating left and right hand under pressure. So for example, as I'm reading that, it's when one is on stage performing and there's a little bit of nervousness, and you want how to keep the nerves in check. That's that part of that. And timing is a really good appropriate an appropriate question, because our perception of time. I've talked to students about this a lot. In the practice room, and our perception of time in the concert hall for an audience, well, they're not necessarily the same. So the first thing is, a stock answer probably would be to assume, it's dangerous, but we learn things about ourselves, to assume that we might want to play certain things, especially fast music, a little too fast in concert. So to make a conscious effort to just control the tempo. Now, we don't want to sound like we're holding back and not being expressive. But it is really easy in performance regarding vibrato, for example, to like go a little bit crazy with the vibrato, and to just kind of lose a little bit of control. So I think the things that I have done are, well, first of all, I mean, as I don't want to say painful as it is, but as scary as it is, I've learned a lot from experience. So the first time I ever played, I'll give an example. The first time I ever played Dvorak Concerto in the late 80s, I remember I played and I got to the end of the not even the end. I got halfway through the first movement and I thought my right hand was going to fall off. Never in rehearsals did I feel this, but I just felt that in the concert. I'm like, oh, this is not good. Luckily, I found that with a rest during the 2Ds, I was able to feel the recovery process, and I was able to carry on. But that led to a years-long search to sort of figure out how, made me rethink bow grip. It made me rethink distribution of weight in the bow. It made me, for example, a lot of pronation, and then the thumb counters that. Does it create squeezing? And I realized that's what was happening to me. So I started to think more about how I distribute weight across the fingers, and then also to start to trust. That's another thing. To believe that I don't have to crank the sound out all the time. I can find a healthy, round, resonant sound, because resonance is a big thing for me. Pulling, as Larry Lesser described it, pulling and pushing the string left to right so as to create a healthy vibration of the string. So I think a lot of what I've done is to just go out and have experiences, thoughtful ones, hopefully, in performance, and then reevaluate afterward. Recording can be helpful in that regard. Now, just fundamental, like some people get more nervous than others. I don't necessarily feel that I'm a nervous player, but I do know that, when I get excited, I will do those things that I was talking about. I will sometimes over-vibrate, or I'll play a little too fast, or I'll push through a passage where I don't mean to push. And literally some of the things I have done have been just to breathe, make sure I'm breathing well, to prepare through visualization, to do proper number of run-throughs so I can imagine what the performance is going to be like, to sometimes take a little bit of edge off deliberately in performance because I know that might counter the tendency to overdo, and then just the last part of that question, relationship between how much vibrato is appropriate for how much bow, that becomes an interesting comment or topic to address as well, because vibrato, I mean, I've really come to believe that vibrato, let me put it this way, I think I used to fixate on vibrato even too much, and to the point where I was thinking about it more than what I was doing with the bow. So for me, everything we do is about the bow, unless it's pizzicato, but that's everything we do is about the bow because there's where we're creating the sound. Vibrato has to enhance that. So in many respects, I think less is more with vibrato. We don't want to, again, I'll use this passage. Obviously, I'm not going to do a ton of vibrato there. What if I use no vibrato? Could almost pull that off. I think it puts a lot more sort of attention. It draws the attention to everything that's happening with the bow. There's no hiding when you do this. But I really believe that the vibrato can be tamed in a lot of cases. Even even though that's loud and rich, I don't want to overdo the vibrato in that case because I want it to be about the clarity and directness of sound. So these are big topics. I'm just tossing some first thoughts out at you. Feel free to ask other things. There is another question here. Do you have any thoughts on how one can adapt quickly to difficult conditions and sizes of concert halls' rooms? As practice spaces are usually in small rooms, how does one adjust his or her playing when playing in a large hall and gain the feeling to do so? Yeah, I had. I'll just start with something anecdotal. When I was preparing my Bach suites recently, my week of Bach, I went and played in a class that was about. It's at the Computer Music Center at Stanford, where they study acoustics quite a lot. And my colleague had created a program wherein different acoustics could be replicated. There's a room in the Computer Music Center with speakers all around, like 360 degrees, speakers underneath as well as above and around. And so he was switching the acoustic, even though the room was small, from everything, including the church at Stanford, which is a very large space, Notre Dame Cathedral, the church in Köthen where Bach played the organ, and various other places. And it was really interesting to think about how those spaces affected my own playing. So first thing is, and I remember I had my last high school teacher at Eastman told me when I went off to conservatory, he said, beware the practice room sound. I remember he said those words to me. And so you play in the practice room, and some practice rooms are loud. And doing the conservatory back in the day, before they built the magnificent new building, the practice rooms were sometimes impossible to find. So we practiced in bathrooms and stairwells, and the sound was awful and loud, and you can't really get a good sense of what you're doing in these kinds of acoustics. So you may be aware that Wenger makes these practice modules now where you can set the thing that I was just talking about, recreating these churches and these acoustics, where you push a button and you have cathedral and stadium and all this sort of thing. And yet, the big hall will always feel different. And I personally, just full disclosure and admission here, I don't love playing in really large halls because I think, well, this is a cello. I mean, I feel like I'm someone who makes a pretty healthy, big sound when I need to, but I feel like I'm no match for this big space. So I've spent a lot of time over the years in my head, mentally going through and telling myself there's only so much sound I can make. I can't, if I'm playing, I will learn what this is like with Don Quixote, especially an orchestra of people who haven't played it. They may not be as sensitive as a seasoned professional orchestra, but I know there's only so much sound I can make. And if I play Dvorak concerto, I think, oh my, I've got to crank the sound out this way. from the beginning, if I have that mindset, well, first of all, I'm not going to survive the performance, but second of all, I'm going to be overplaying the instrument. So there's a point at which it's far too much. So I think one thing is, on one hand, I feel like we should play the way we play. We should find our sound and be true to that sound. Now, it's impossible not to be influenced by the space in which you're playing. It's impossible. But I don't believe we should go into a big hall and say, okay, now I'm in the big hall, I'm going to switch to loud playing. Now I'm in a small hall, I'm going to tone it down. I think we should just let the adjustment feel natural. Now, the only way to do that is to have some time in the space, I think. And I would also encourage all of you, especially students at music schools and departments and such, to vary the experiences of practice. So in any way that you can, sneak into a big space when you can, and play in the big space, and just get a feel for what comes back at you, and do it enough so that it doesn't feel abnormal, it doesn't feel uncomfortable, and I honestly believe it will get more and more comfortable the more you do it. So I think it's really important to have those experiences, and I think it's important to accept. And granted, I mean, a lot of the great solo cellists, Rostropovich, I mentioned him many times today, really cranked out the sound. But still, a cello is a cello, and we have to mostly focus on warmth, resonance, clarity. Clarity is another, articulation is another big topic. If we articulate well, notes speak better, and they can be heard at a further distance. So I think we have to spend a lot of time thinking about those things, and but also that in combination with just playing in different size spaces as often as you can. I think that's really, really key. So the next question is, can you discuss the process of developing your personal sound character? Every great musician has a sound that is identifiable. You know exactly who's playing without seeing them, exactly, such as Rostropovich or Daniel Schafran. In the wake of the iconic recording of Don Quixote that you have shown, how do you go about crafting a performance and interpretation that is truly yours and unique? Well, that's a wonderful question. And I think about the recordings that I have heard, and sometimes the cellist is very bold, sometimes the cellist is much less so. Lynn Harrell sounds like Lynn Harrell, and Rostropovich sounds like Rostropovich. So on one level, when we play, the cello, because we have our voice through our instrument, which is, as I was saying, we think of the bow as creating that sound, the vibrato is enhancing it, and they work together. And Lynn Harrell, of course, we think about his bow arm, but we also think a lot about how his gigantic hands. He visited Stanford a year or two before he died, and my wife held her hand up to his, and I did as well. At a certain point, we got photos, and his fingers were approximately 1 digit longer than mine. And my hands are not small. So you think about how he manipulates his left hand and fingers to create slides and shifts and vibrato and that sort of thing. So even when he's characterizing this music, this character of Don Quixote, he sounds like him, and which is great. We want him to sound like him. I think we don't want to pretend to be someone else. I've known cellists, they're so enamored of a certain player, and they spend a lot of time trying to sound like that player. And I strongly discourage that. But although we should listen to those players. And I think in terms of developing sound, I've spent a lot of time, even when I was younger, but even, I continue to, now that as I said, I'm well into my 50s, I continue to think about how I'm transferring weight and how I'm getting the string to vibrate. And I try to listen for it being healthy. And when I hear something I don't like, when I hear a shrill vibrato or not catching the string well, I'll get that from recordings or even under my ear. I'll try to understand why that happened and try to work with it. But I do think a personal singing voice through the instrument is something we have to strive for. We have to find our sense of legato. We have to find our sense of articulation. And it's through trial and error. It's through in many cases very careful thought and calculation, and then we have to just play a lot and just get a feel for what we're doing, so that what we're doing is us. What each of us is doing is our own personal opinion. And I think also one more thing to say about that, playing in ensembles is really important. You play in an orchestra, you can't really hear yourself, and yet you have to learn to blend with people around you. Chamber music is perhaps more meaningful that way, not to put down orchestra playing in any way, because you can hear yourself, but you can also hear how your sound integrates with others. And I think I've learned a lot about my personal voice and my concept of sound and tone through playing in quartets. I've been in quartets for 27 years, St. Lawrence and then Chicago before that. And really, I learned so much about how I make sound, how it blends with others, how it connects to other people's playing. And therefore, in the process, still working on being my own personality, because I believe even in a quartet, each person has to have a personality. So it's, again, these topics are wonderful questions, and we could go down many paths with in answering any of them. So I'll just move on because I want to get to the others. Next one is, do you have any advice on how to play freely within the meter of music and judge appropriate rubato and a cello rondo whilst playing with pianist or orchestra? Excellent question. That's come up about 10 times in the last week with my students. And in fact, I'm about to play, I mentioned I have a few smaller concerts coming up. One is in a little less than a week, I'm playing C major Beethoven Sonata with one of my Stanford colleagues. And we're talking a lot about rubato and flexibility in the music. And he is also a scholar, so meaning he does a fair bit of work as a musicologist. And he's been reading about Beethoven and interpreting Beethoven in Beethoven's day and this sort of thing. But it's interesting. I mean, my fundamental answer to that is, I think in order to discover a way to be free, and in order to discover a way to successfully play with the rubato and flexibility, one has to be able to play very much in a strict meter, so in a strict tempo. So that is to say, it's for example, even a cadenza in a Haydn concerto that we play. Not that we should play it with a metronome necessarily, but we should know how everything fits together structurally, so we know where the beats are. We know where they fall if they're in a predictable place. And then we start to explore, well, if I play it exactly this way, it feels too vertical, it feels too stiff. What if I move this a little bit and then hold back there? I mean, we tend to think of rubato as pushing and pulling, even though literally that's not what the word means. But still, it means to take, but not give back. But we pull a little bit, we give back, and we have to experiment with that. But I think it starts with really finding a more strict way of playing, and then drifting from that. And I often suggest to students, and in Bach this comes up a lot, because we have these, in each suite, 5 dance movements. Oh, well, somebody's dancing. Well, no, actually, they weren't written to be danced to specifically. They're just in the dance form. But they have a clear meter, clear sense of physical motion. So at first, you want to be able to know that you can play it strictly. And then you want to find your flexibility, but you don't want to add a beat or take a beat away. You don't want to drift completely away from that. So I suggest putting a metronome on and then not being with it, except for some of the time. So you make sure like every downbeat has to align, or every first and third beat has to align, where things will align, but in between those beats you build some freedom, but you don't lose track of what that pulse is. And I find that can be a really useful way to find flexibility without losing track of what that fundamental beat is. And I think that could be a very, very, very useful technique. I mean, we've all heard great artists even get a little carried away with the rubato and losing track of pulse and tempo altogether. And it can be I remember it can be disturbing hearing a great pianist who's no longer with us, and a European pianist, play some late Brahms piano pieces. And I was in the audience with a colleague, and he was just one of the most beautiful players I've ever heard still to this day. And but he played these Brahms pieces, and he was just pushing and pulling and changing tempo everywhere, and it was driving us both crazy. And it got me thinking more about being, sort of true to the pulse. On the other hand, we know that there are traditions that go back to when a lot of these pieces that involved, those traditions involved a lot of give and take, and a lot of those traditions go back to pre-recording, so we could do our research and read and say how much flexibility can there be. But to me it's a huge topic, and I'll give one more example and then one more question I see here. There was a great recording of, I think it's Grieg Third Sonata with Chrysler and Rachmaninoff in the slow movement, and that's I'm probably in the wrong beat. He goes. that's the main theme of that movement. And they play, and they don't play even eighth notes. They don't play. They're all sort of distorted in an interesting way. They don't even sound together when they're playing, and yet they're together because they're of similar mind, and they find a way to be free even with each other and with the music, where you still can tell where the beat is, but you wouldn't. Most of the beats would not align with the metronome. So we can get inspiration from some of those recordings as well, as long as we're not directly imitating them. And then there's one more question here. Could you talk about how to clearly shape phrases and make musical ideas obvious and communicate to the listener? Thank you for your time. Oh yeah. Well, the first thing to say about that is exaggerate. I mean, you have to. We have information on the page which is minimal in most cases, unless you're talking about Second Viennese School and late 19th century German Romanticism, where huge descriptive titles, words about how you should move here and hold back there, and shape the phrase here and there. And this phrase that I've now played many times for you, that closing of Don Quixote, there's nothing on the page at all. There's no dynamic. There's no phrase shape. But of course, we're going to play with the shape. And I think the first thing to say is to just do more than you think. I mean, be sure that you shape the phrase to the extent that you feel like you're going a little bit beyond what you probably ought to do. Because in most cases, I find that it's the tendency is to underdo. The tendency is in performance not to do enough of phrase shaping. That is, and I think now it doesn't mean to for example, if you're going up in the phrase and you want to intensify, to like press the sound or overdo the intensity of that, but it's just making your path clear and clearer and clearer. I mean, it's always an important thing to do, and I think exaggeration is probably the quick answer to that, and then of course how much to exaggerate. But I mean, you've got to try some things out to see, but do more than you think. Now, a list of questions has popped up, so I'm going to just go through them. Questions for undergraduates from segment. What is the first thing you do on the cello every day? Well, I often don't tune first. I have a weird thing about tuning. I don't like to spend a lot of time tuning. However, I mean tuning the instrument, although we do need our instruments to be in tune. I will usually just play a few long bows just to get the arm loosened up. Depending on how my hand feels and what time of day it is when I'm starting to practice, I might just do some slow wobbly vibrato playing on single notes and try to match the finger, the width and speed of the vibrato for the dynamic. And then I play scales. I tell people all the time, play some scales. Scales can be slow. Think about how the bow is working, how the left hand's working, intonation, vibrato or no vibrato if you want to do them without vibrato. So scales, and then I always add the corresponding arpeggio, major or minor. A scale practice method that I learned when I was very young is in order to focus well, focus on a different thing in each octave. So one octave could be just about sound and bow. Another octave could be intonation. Another could be vibrato. Another could be posture. Another could be your general level of peace and how you appear with your face, especially if you're looking at a mirror. So I always do that sort of thing at the beginning. And then here's, why do you practice? What drives and motivates you? Anything that helped during the pandemic? Yeah. Well, I confess to having gotten all those years in string quartet, and with due respect to quartets and with all respect to players of quartets, a lot of the quartets I was playing, I'd played a lot, and so I didn't feel motivated to practice them, plus rehearsing them a lot as well. So if you rehearse 20 hours a week, and we played a lot of Haydn quartets, for example, and they do merit individual practice, but I found myself not necessarily motivated to practice those parts. So, and then in teaching, I like to have the pieces sort of in my repertoire. I like to actually teach most repertoire the students are playing from memory. If I've played it before, if it's a piece I don't know, that's different. I will sometimes practice the pieces that my students are working on. But for me, it's what motivates me is having projects. So even during the pandemic, that's a really good question. I wanted to learn some new rep, or really restudy some Bach, for example, during the pandemic. Or I was making videos for posting because we couldn't play live concerts. For me, I do much better when I have something to aim for. Now, it doesn't have to be a big Carnegie Hall concert or anything of that nature, or even a concert. I just can set a goal and say, I want to learn this piece by this time. But I need to set goals. And so that's what motivates me. I mean, when more than anything else, these projects coming up certainly do. The Bach Suites project that I just did was a big one, and it made me practice way more than I had been practicing. And I noticed the positive impact when I went to play other repertoire. I was like, oh, I can actually, I feel a little more confident. I've been spending more time on the instrument, and therefore I feel more adept at doing all sorts of playing. So I think having the goals is very important for me, and creating projects so that I have those goals. And then the next question, it says, how do you go about deepening your musical imagination? Yeah, wow. Boy, that's a big one. I mean, one thing I find interesting is going back to pieces that I've played, and I'm old enough now that I'm, restudying pieces for like the fifth time in some cases or more. And sort of clearing my head, like going back to my Bach, so one thing I did in this Bach project is I played the fifth not retuned. I played it with keeping the open A as an open A, and I actually love it with the scordatura. I love it with the A tuned to a G, and I recorded it that way. But I thought I just don't want to mess around with the retuning all the time, so I had to completely restudy it and rethink it, and that you could think of as a technical thing. But in the process, I started to think, suppose I took this tempo, or suppose I rethought my sort of approach to the energy of this movement, or whatever the case may be. So it's a lot of the time I like to just have a clean part and restart the process. I don't tend to mark much, if anything, in my parts, so I generally have mostly clean parts. Which I know drives some of my students crazy because I can't hand them something. I have to go through it with them. But for me, it keeps my mind open. So I'm always searching for new things. Like, for example, I can give you a couple Bach examples. For years, I played slurring 8. Now, we all know that in the Anna Magdalena manuscript, she does not write 8 notes slurred. And Honor Bilsma believed strongly that it's not even 3 + 1 + separates. There's a whole other fancy bowing there that I've tried, and it's really hard. But for the first time in my life, 3 weeks ago, I played and a number of things like that I did in the course of the 6 suites, where I just kind of tried new stuff. And you have to be brave and bold to some degree to do that, because you feel like, oh, is it going to work? Is anybody going to like it? But you have to try. Another thing was Dvorak Concerto. I was inspired by a performance I saw of Miklos Perényi, a Hungarian cellist, and instead of sort of going for it, he did this sort of where it was very sustained and singing, and I immediately was thrilled, because for years I didn't necessarily love the vertical way that piece can come across. So I'm always just sort of searching, restudying. Recordings can be helpful in that way as well. Is there a particular practice method that you swear by that has remained of constant value for you over the years? A go-to strategy? Yeah, practice slowly. Practice sort of perpetual motion type passages with different rhythms. These techniques, I still use these techniques. Practice with rhythms, practice slowly. I've added to that, but I've extended that a little bit, or augmented it a little bit by adding, when you practice slowly a passage that you're going to play faster, think about what it feels like to play it faster. Now, you might have to imagine, if you're not ready to play it fast yet, you might not totally know. But if you play, let me just think of something that is fast, and you could practice it slowly, like, so that if you don't think about, so that's pretty straightforward in terms of hand position, but like here, if your hand's a little square, it's maybe harder to move it. when you're playing faster. But in a slow tempo, you can get away with hand positions that don't work when you play faster. So I think even when we practice slowly, we have to imagine what faster is going to be like. I also, in passages like that, I also believe, and I teach and practice proper etudes this way, becoming comfortable with each position where you have a whole group of notes, then move to the next position, play those notes, whatever. I wish, again, I have to pull up some examples. And then, so separating the feeling of each position from the actual shift to get into that position, and then tying it together. So really getting comfortable in each quadrant of the fingerboard, so that you know what that position feels like, and then you add to that the motion of actually getting to that place. So even something like right, so you have this. Now you have to think, okay, I've got to aim, and then you have this, that you have to know what this feels like. So, and then I'm gonna, after a few times of separating, I'm going to tie them together. And even coming back, you have 3 notes, and then I'm thinking, okay, well now I'm going to have to prepare for the G sharp. And then I find that I can move more seamlessly. So it's really sort of, there's a kind of a structure to how I break these sorts of things down, and I try to practice every piece in this way. Good. We have a few more questions. How do you manage lots of repertoire at the same time? Yeah, that's a tough one. It kind of depends on what that group of pieces is. You can't practice all of it every day, most likely. I mean, perhaps when I was in school and practicing 6 hours a day, I did. But you know, you have to prioritize. Excuse me. And you know, for example, if you have 5 pieces you're working on in a given day, you might you know, pick designate certain passages from each piece as something you want to work on, and break it down that way, so that you're being attentive to all the pieces that you're working on, but you're not trying to get through them all at once. I mean, but the truth is, if you have a lot of pieces, at a certain point you probably will have to tend to them, you know, each day that you're practicing them, and that just takes more time. But presumably, targeted practice. I think the answer is just targeted practice, efficient targeted practice, where you isolate. I had a teacher once who he would want me to isolate like 2 notes, and I would add a couple notes before it. He goes, no, just those 2 notes. He was so meticulous about getting me to focus on the problem, or the thing that needed the most attention, and that speaks to efficiency. And I think efficiency becomes the key when you have a lot of repertoire going on, really deciding how you're going to break things down, or just simply decide, you know, today I'm only going to deal with this piece, tomorrow I'm going to deal with that piece. You know, you can map out a sort of practice strategy over the course of a week, for example, and do it that way. Just a couple of thoughts there. Next question: how has your practicing evolved over the years, or even recently? Is there anything that has surprised you? Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think I've become, back to my previous answer, I've become more efficient in practicing. I think part of that is by necessity. Arnold Steinhardt says in his book, Indivisible by 4, he talks about, you know, that time in your life when you're young, you're in your teens and upper teens, when you can really put all those hours in. And then when you get to be so-called professional and you're running around a lot, you don't have all those hours anymore. The stuff of life takes a lot of your time. So I think I've learned to become considerably more efficient, to to always be mindful in how I'm approaching something in my practice methods, and to not spend so much time practicing things that I know I'm confident playing already. I mean, less time there, maybe not no time, but less time, and then more time on the things that really need it, and it's just developing that sense of efficiency. Is there anything that has surprised you? Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I suppose sometimes I'm surprised that I can still play something that I haven't played for a long time, and vice versa. Sometimes I'm still surprised that I could play something yesterday and I can't play it today. But I actually enjoy those experiences, because then I have to say, well, why was I able to play it yesterday? What's different today? And really thinking about what physically might be different, or mentally, where my headspace, what's different for me. And I think, really coming to terms with those things and getting to know oneself as a player, and as a worker, as somebody who has to get a job done, I think it's really important to get to know those things. And then one more question here. I love your playing and music making. Thank you, John Stewart. Thank you so much. How has your Bach changed over the years? Yeah. Well, I mean, just on this, my recent Bach project is such that I started thinking about re-recording them since 10 years ago was when I made my first recording. And when I made it, I was sort of like, well, everybody's recorded Bach. Who's going to listen? But I did it anyway, and I was proud of how it turned out. But now I do a lot of things differently. I showed you a couple of things, a lot of different bowings, some different tempo. I'm not inclined to play faster than that, for example, for that one Courante, the Sixth Suite. Whereas I would have been inclined to play somewhat faster in the old days. I'm even sort of interested in, I've been saying lately that as I get older, I like fast movements slower and slow movements faster, and I'm just worried that at some point I'm only going to play one tempo. But I have found that it's important to give oneself time to do what needs to be done. So if there's a big motion across the fingerboard, or you have to play a chord, it might take a little bit of time. And in Bach, you could, back to the earlier question about pulse and tempo and rubato, I like to try to do my best to remain true to a stable tempo, but I also give myself a little freedom to expand when it feels like it's the right thing to do musically. Ideally musically, but sometimes for technical reasons. And when it is for technical reasons, I try to make it into something musical, so that it's not just, okay, I need more time there, I'm just going to take it. Well, I need more time there, how can I make that part of the music? So I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. I have been examining the Anna Magdalena manuscript a lot more closely than I used to. And I could show you a lot of examples of that if we had lots of time. I'm not necessarily going to be strict about it like Honor Bilsma was. You may know his book, Bach the Fencing Master, and he talks so much about following these bowings that are in the Anna Magdalena. But I'm not inclined to do that, but I am inclined to be more true to... I think I added a lot of slurs, basically, in all of the suites over the years, and I'm taking a lot of them out now. So that's sort of where I am with it in a nutshell. Okay, great. Now it looks like that is the end of questions. So thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure to be here and to open my brain more to Don Quixote as I prepare to jump into it, and just to share a few little ideas about it. I know they were, a lot of them were just sort of quick thoughts, but nonetheless, it's a monumental piece and something that I'm very excited about.